Once upon a time, in a peaceful village of Alawa, lived two young siblings named Jide and Kike. They were as close as two peas in a pod, always together, laughing and playing, whether at home or school. Every morning, just as the first rays of the sun painted the sky a soft pink, Jide and Kike would jump out of bed, full of energy and excitement. Their day began with the careful packing of their school bags, filled with books, pencils, and neatly wrapped lunches prepared by their mother. With bright eyes and wide smiles, they would wave goodbye to their parents who stood by the front door, watching with pride as their little ones grew. Their father would give a gentle nod, and their mother, Mrs. Paroku, would call out, "Remember to behave and work hard today?" Jide and Kike eagerly waited by the front gate of their modest yet cozy home, which was surrounded by a colorful garden their mother tended to every day. They weren't just waiting for any ordinary ride to school. They were waiting for Uncle Sei, the kind-hearted man who had become an important part of their lives. Uncle Sei wasn't just their driver, he was their friend, their storyteller, and in many ways their protector. His shiny red motorcycle, which gleamed in the morning sunlight, was as familiar to them as their school bags. The motorcycle's low hum as it approached always brought a sense of joy and anticipation, like the start of a grand adventure. Uncle Sei had been taking Jide and Kike to school for as long as they could remember, long before they were old enough to understand the meaning of trust. He would arrive promptly every morning, dressed in his neat blue jacket with a warm smile stretching from ear to ear. As soon as the children hopped onto the back of the motorcycle, Uncle Sei would rev the engine, and off they would go, the wind whooshing past their faces, making their hair dance in the breeze. Uncle Sei wasn't just a driver, he was a storyteller, weaving magical tales that kept Jide and Kike entertained throughout the ride. From stories of brave warriors who saved their villages to tales of clever animals outsmarting the wicked, every day was a new adventure in their minds. Jide and Kike loved school. They loved the excitement of learning new things, playing with friends, and participating in activities. But there was something else they loved just as much, if not more: Uncle Sei. He wasn't just someone who gave them a ride, he was someone they looked forward to seeing each morning. His gentle nature, his patience, and his never-failing punctuality made him a constant source of comfort in their young lives. No matter how early or cold the mornings were, Uncle Sei was always there, smiling, ready to take them to school safely. Their parents, Mr. and Mrs. Paroku, had grown to trust him completely, knowing that their children were in good hands. One evening after dinner, Mrs. Paroku gathered Jide and Kike in the living room and sat them down. With a soft smile, she spoke, "Children, Uncle Sei is like family now. He has been with us for so long, and we trust him, but you must always remember something important." The children looked up, curious. "Always pray," she continued. "Because God listens to little hearts like yours. You can trust people, but trust God the most. Say a little prayer every morning before you go out, and he will keep you safe." Jide and Kike nodded, taking their mother's words to heart. From that day on, before stepping out of the house, they clasped their little hands together and whispered a prayer, feeling a sense of peace wash over them, knowing that both God and Uncle Sei were watching over them. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the bond between Jide, Kike, and Uncle Sei grew stronger. Each ride to school became more than just a journey. It was a time of joy, learning, and laughter, wrapped in the warmth of trust and love. And every time they sped through the village, with the wind rushing past and Uncle Sei's stories filling the air, Jide and Kike knew they were not just on their way to school. They were on a journey filled with faith, trust, and the beauty of life's little moments. One fateful afternoon, after the final school bell had rung and the sun hung low in the sky, Uncle Sei arrived at the school gate to pick up Jide and Kike as usual. The day had been filled with the usual excitement of learning and playing, and the siblings eagerly ran towards Uncle Sei, their laughter filling the air. With their school bags bouncing on their backs, they hopped onto the familiar red motorcycle, their faces glowing with joy as they began their ride home. The winding road that led back to their village was peaceful, lined with tall trees that swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. As they rode along, the children giggled and chattered about their day, their voices lively and full of innocence, recounting stories about their friends, teachers, and the games they had played during recess. It was a perfect afternoon, the kind that made them feel safe, surrounded by the familiar sights of their village and the comforting presence of Uncle Sei. But just as they rounded a bend, the peacefulness of the moment was shattered. Out of nowhere, two rough-looking men emerged from the dense bushes that flanked the road. The men moved quickly, stepping into the path of the motorcycle with a menacing air. Their clothes were dirty, their faces shadowed by grime and malice. Uncle Sei's grip on the handlebars tightened as his heart raced. He instinctively tried to swerve the bike, hoping to avoid the men, but they stepped further into the road, waving their hands aggressively to force him to stop. The cheerful mood of the ride dissolved in an instant, replaced by a tense, suffocating fear. Uncle Sei's face darkened with worry, his usual calm demeanor replaced by dread. The air seemed heavier now, thick with danger, and the children's laughter abruptly ceased. Sensing something was terribly wrong, Jide and Kite clung to each other tightly, their hearts beating loudly in their chests. Their young minds couldn't fully grasp what was happening, but they knew enough to be scared. "Get off the bike," one of the men barked in a rough, commanding voice, his eyes cold and unforgiving. He took a step closer, towering over the motorcycle, his presence threatening and imposing. Uncle Sei, trying to suppress the fear rising within him, swallowed hard and asked, "What do you want?" His voice, though shaking slightly, held a hint of bravery. He knew he had to be strong, not just for himself, but for the children whose safety now depended on him.
I hope you are enjoying the story. Please, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so that you will be notified anytime I upload new video. Now let's continue the story.
The taller of the two men, who seemed to be the leader, sneered as he pointed directly at Jide and Kike. His voice was chilling as he said, "We want the children." At those words, Jide's heart skipped a beat. He could feel the blood drain from his face as a wave of terror swept over him. Kike, too, felt the cold grip of fear tightening around her small body. Without thinking, Jide reached for Kike's hand, holding it tightly as though his grip alone could protect her. They were both trembling now, their innocent faces pale with fear as they stared at the men, their young minds racing to make sense of the nightmare that was unfolding before them. Uncle Sei's face contorted with a mix of fear and determination. He quickly jumped off the bike, positioning himself between the children and the men, his arms spread wide as though his mere presence could shield them from the danger that loomed. "You can't have them," he shouted, his voice filled with both fear and fury. "They're just innocent children. Please, let us go." His words hung in the air like a fragile plea, a desperate attempt to appeal to whatever shred of humanity the men might still have. Uncle Sei's body was tense, his heart pounding in his chest as he stood firm, refusing to let these men harm Jide and Kike. He knew he was outnumbered and outmatched, but his courage in that moment came from a place deeper than fear, a place of love and protection for the children he had grown to care for like his own. But the men were merciless, their intentions clear and cruel. Without hesitation, they shoved Uncle Sei aside with a force that sent him stumbling to the ground. His knees scraped against the rough gravel of the road, and a sharp pain shot through his body. But he didn't care about his own hurt. His eyes widened in horror as he watched the men grab Jide and Kike with rough hands, yanking them from the motorcycle. Desperation surged through Uncle Sei as he scrambled to his feet, but the taller man turned and glared at him, his eyes cold and full of warning. "Stay down if you value your life," the man growled. Uncle Sei froze, his heart torn between fear for his own life and the overwhelming guilt of not being able to protect the children. He watched helplessly as Jide struggled against the men's grip, his young voice breaking through the thick air. "Leave us alone," Jide cried out, his voice high and trembling with fear. He pulled against their grasp, trying to shield Kike with his small body, but his strength was no match for the ruthless hands that held him. The men ignored his pleas, their faces set in cruel determination. In a matter of moments, the men produced rough ropes from their tattered bags and, with swift, practiced movements, tied the children's hands together. The ropes bit into their small wrists, the coarse fibers rubbing their skin raw. Kike's eyes were wide with terror, her tears falling silently down her cheeks. She looked at Jide and for the first time saw the same fear mirrored in his usually brave face. It was a fear that sank deep into their bones, a fear they had never known before. The men, satisfied with their work, dragged Jide and Kike towards the edge of the road, where the forest loomed dark and foreboding. The thick trees, their branches twisted and knotted, seemed to reach out like silent sentinels, waiting to swallow them whole. The children's small feet stumbled over the uneven ground as they were pulled deeper into the dense underbrush. Each step they took seemed to carry them farther away from the safety of the world they knew, farther from the village, and farther from the loving arms of their parents. Uncle Sei, still on his knees, shouted after them, his voice cracking with panic and despair. "Please, don't take them. Take me instead." His words, though desperate, fell on deaf ears. The men didn't stop, didn't turn back. They were like shadows, vanishing into the depths of the forest, dragging the children with them. Uncle Sei's heart sank, his helplessness overwhelming him like a tidal wave. The image of the children being pulled away haunted him as he sat there, powerless to intervene, his body shaking with the weight of his failure. As they were forced deeper into the forest, the world around Jide and Kike seemed to close in. The tall trees blocked out the light, and the air grew thick and humid, filled with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant animal calls. Despite the fear coursing through them, the lessons their mother had taught them resurfaced in their minds. They remembered her words, "Always pray, no matter what. God listens to little hearts like yours." And so, even as the men's grip tightened and their surroundings grew more terrifying, Jide and Kike began to pray. Their voices were soft, barely above a whisper, but in the quietness of the forest, their prayers felt powerful. "Dear God, protect us," Jide whispered, his voice trembling but resolute. "Dear God, save us," Kike echoed, her eyes closed tightly as she tried to block out the fear. They repeated the prayers over and over, each word giving them strength, each whispering a lifeline to the faith their mother had instilled in them. Though their hands were bound and they were being dragged into an uncertain fate, their spirits held on to the hope that somewhere, somehow, God was listening. Even as the darkness of the forest surrounded them, a flicker of light remained in their hearts, a small but powerful belief that they would be saved. The men dragged Jide and Kike through the dense forest for what felt like hours until they reached a hidden camp tucked away from the prying eyes of the outside world. The camp was small, with tattered tents and makeshift shelters scattered around a central fire, where several men sat, their faces shadowed by the flickering flames. The moment the children were brought into the camp, all eyes turned toward them. The men gathered around the fire had a hunger in their eyes, not for food, but for something far darker. Their gazes lingered on the children with a kind of greed that sent a chill down Jide's spine. He held Kike's hand tighter, their bond the only comfort in this terrifying new world. But despite the danger that surrounded them, Jide and Kike remained calm. They remembered their mother's words, and in their hearts they prayed, even as the men leered at them. Even as the fear tried to claw its way into their minds, the children's faith anchored them. Every heartbeat was a prayer whispered in silence. Every breath carried the same words: "Dear God, protect us. Dear God, save us." Though their young bodies trembled, their spirits remained unbroken.
I hope you are enjoying the story. Please, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so that you will be notified anytime I upload new video. Now let's continue the story.
Days passed in the camp, but to Jide and Kike, it felt like an eternity. The men tried everything to break their will. They forced the children to carry heavy loads, threatened them with harsh words, and even dangled promises of release if they would obey. But no matter what they did, Jide and Kike refused to give in to fear. Their prayers had become their shield, a wall between them and the evil intentions of the men. With each passing day, the men grew more frustrated. Their usual methods, which had worked on others, seemed powerless against these two small children. It wasn't just their calmness that unnerved the kidnappers, it was their unwavering faith, their refusal to bow to fear, that made the men uneasy. Kike, in particular, found solace in the rhythm of her prayers. When the men were cruel, she whispered her prayer under her breath, so quietly that only Jide could hear. And when the night was at its darkest and the cold of the forest crept into their bones, she would repeat her prayers again, until the fear melted away, and she found peace. Jide, though scared himself, drew strength from watching his sister. He knew that as long as they held on to their faith, as long as they kept praying, they would not be lost. Meanwhile, back in the village, chaos had erupted. The news of the children's disappearance spread like wildfire, and fear gripped the hearts of every family. No one knew who had taken them or why, but all eyes quickly turned to the last person who had been seen with Jide and Kike, Uncle Say. The village police, in their desperation to find the children, arrested him almost immediately. Uncle Say was well known in the village for his kindness and loyalty, but suspicion is a cruel force, and the fear of the unknown made people forget who he really was. In the dark, cramped cell where Uncle Say was held, he sat with his hands shackled, his heart heavy with worry. The police interrogated him endlessly, accusing him of being involved in the kidnapping. They couldn't understand how the children could have disappeared without his knowledge. He was the last one to see them, after all. The chief of police, a burly man with a stern face, stood over him and shouted, "Where are the children? Tell us the truth." But Uncle Say had no answers. His voice cracked with exhaustion as he pleaded with him. "I swear on my life, I had nothing to do with it. I would never harm those children. They are like family to me." But his words fell on deaf ears. The village police, growing impatient, resorted to harsher methods. They beat him, hoping the pain would loosen his tongue, hoping to force a confession. Uncle Say's body was bruised and his spirit battered, but still, he held firm. He knew in his heart that the children were out there somewhere, praying for protection. And though he was powerless in his cell, he whispered his own prayers for their safety, trusting that God would hear them all. The village, meanwhile, buzzed with rumors. Some whispered that Uncle Say had been involved all along, that maybe he had planned the kidnapping for money. Others defended him, insisting that he was innocent. But doubt had already crept into the hearts of many. The Paroka family, devastated by the loss of their children, wept bitterly every night. Mrs. Paroka's heart ached for Jide and Kike, and though she had prayed for their safety, The uncertainty gnawed at her soul. How could this happen? She asked over and over, her tears soaking the prayer mat where she knelt. Yet even in the midst of the despair that had enveloped the village, one thing remained constant. The faith of two small children hidden deep within the forest. Their prayers, quiet but persistent, carried their hope through the darkness, believing that somehow, some way, they would be saved. Back in the camp, frustration simmered among the kidnappers. The leader, who had once looked upon Jide and Kike with cold greed, now paced angrily around the fire, his patience wearing thin. "These children are useless," he spat, his voice rising above the crackling flames. His face was twisted in rage, the veins in his neck bulging as he glared at the two small figures huddled together. The other men grumbled in agreement, casting annoyed glances at the children. They had expected fear, compliance, maybe even tears, but instead Jide and Kike had shown nothing but quiet resilience. "They're not afraid, and they won't do anything we ask," one of the men shouted, slamming his fist into the ground. His frustration echoed through the camp. They had tried threats, intimidation, and even bribes, but nothing seemed to work. The children had refused to play the role of helpless victims, their calmness unnerving the men more than any tears or cries ever could. But what the men couldn't see was that Jide and Kike's strength came from a place far deeper than their small bodies or quiet voices. It came from the prayers that they whispered softly under their breath, even as the danger closed in around them. Every time the men's voices rose in anger, every time they were threatened or pushed, the children prayed, "Dear God, protect us. Dear God, save us." They repeated silently, their lips barely moving but their hearts unwavering. It was this faith that kept them calm, even in the face of such overwhelming fear. They believed that God was watching over them, and no matter what the men did, they refused to lose that faith. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of trying to break the children's spirits, the men gave up. They stood around the fire, their shoulders slumped in defeat, their faces lined with exhaustion. The leader, his patience completely spent, waved his hand dismissively. "Enough! They're not worth the trouble," he muttered, his voice heavy with frustration. The men nodded, their greed now replaced with a bitter sense of failure. They knew they couldn't control the children, couldn't break their will, and it frustrated them to no end. In the dead of night, with only the distant sound of crickets filling the silence, the men carried Jide and Kike to a nearby road. It was a quiet, lonely stretch, hidden deep in the forest, far from the village or any sign of help. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light over the dirt road, making the shadows of the trees seem even darker and more menacing. The men, wanting to be rid of the children, tied their hands and feet, leaving them bound and helpless on the cold ground. Jide and Kike lay still, their bodies trembling, but not from fear. The road stretched out before them like an endless path of uncertainty. They could hear the wind rustling through the trees, the distant howls of animals echoing in the night, and the sound of the men's footsteps fading into the distance.
Well done for watching this story to this point. Hope it is interesting all through. This is just the beginning of the story. Remember, I covet your subscription so much to help grow this channel. Honestly, it costs you nothing. It's free, just to stay connected to me whenever I upload the next part. Thanks for watching today's story. I believe you enjoyed every bit of it all. Now I want you to do me one favor, subscribe to this channel, like and turn on the notification bell if you have not done so that whenever I release my next video, you will be notified immediately. See you soon.